Hey there, Episcopal Church. In this update, I'd like to address a troubling trend that I see happening in the Episcopal Church, which I think we are all invested in and we all need to think carefully and talk thoroughly about. The trend I'm referring to is that over the last few years, we have seen dioceses needing to collaborate and work together by sharing a bishop. We have seen dioceses that have needed to combine, including the 3 dioceses in Wisconsin joining back together to become one, including the diocese in Upper Michigan joining together to become the Diocese of the Great Lakes. We have celebrated those rejoinings and combinations. We have also seen efforts, a proposal going before General Convention that would allow a large diocese to have more than 2 suffragan bishops, which I see as an effort to allow a large diocese to incorporate smaller dioceses around them by having one diocesan bishop and quite a few bishops suffragan or assisting bishops to help manage the episcopal load of work for a large territory. And we are seeing a continuing trend of dioceses selling off their diocesan offices, moving into rental accommodation, or cutting their staffs due to financial difficulties. Part of this is because the assets of the Episcopal Church are not evenly distributed among us. There are some dioceses with multi-million-dollar endowments and other dioceses with next to nothing. And we are running our diocese in the way we are running our churches, which is to say that every congregation gets what it can afford and no more, and every diocese gets what it can afford and no more. The relationship between congregations and dioceses, the relationship between dioceses and the wider church is really more like a governmental relationship where the money goes in terms of assessment or fair share from the congregations to the diocese, and that is how we are related economically throughout the Episcopal Church. What this trend means and why it is troubling to me is that I think it puts onto the table for all of us the question, and a very important question for the Episcopal Church to consider, and that question is, what is a bishop for anyway? Why do we have bishops? And what is the nature of the relationship we expect to have with our bishop? What role should the bishop play? And what does it mean to be a diocese? You all will remember, I know, that in the early church, the bishop was the chief priest and pastor and teacher in a congregation. In order to have a church, you needed a bishop, someone ordained and recognized by the surrounding churches in order to be the leader and teacher and pastor of that congregation. As the church grew, then deacons were brought in to help assist with administrative tasks and also to make sure the offering was collected and fairly distributed among the members of the congregation, and to help make sure that the church was adequately engaged in helping to meet the needs of the world. As the church grew even further, priests were ordained by the bishop in order to share in the bishop's ministry, extending the sacramental presence and the teaching role of the bishop to make sure that more people could be included. It was only about 500 years or so into the history of the church that the church then became officially recognized by the external government, and the role of bishops started to become more and more like the role of an official in a government. A diocese started to look like a state or a county, and the bishop started to look like the governor of that area. And that is when we started to see that the nature of leadership in the church started to shift and become more and more like it looked like in the secular world outside the Episcopal Church. My church history friends, I know that it is anachronistic to use the term secular in quite the way I'm talking about because the separation of church and state didn't really exist. I get it. But follow the argument. What I'm talking about is the church adopting practices from outside the church's tradition, following the way the world works, or should the church be focused on changing the way the world works by means of the gospel of Jesus Christ? Going into the Middle Ages, we started to have prince bishops. And one of the wrestlings that the Episcopal Church had when we declared our independence from the Church of England was, what sort of bishop should we have? There were lots of debates going on at that time. Should the bishop only be a sacramental presence? Should the bishop only have an administrative function? There was a real concern that bishops not exercise temporal or secular types of authority as those bishops had done in the Middle Ages. And we as an Episcopal Church, intentionally choosing to be an Episcopal Church, not a Presbyterian church governed by the presbyters, not a Baptist church without priests, bishops, or deacons. We decided to be an Episcopal church where the bishop continued to be the chief teacher and pastor, also the leader of a diocese. And thus, a diocese was a territory that had a bishop. The Episcopal Church, I think it's time we had a conversation about what we think a diocese is. And I think as we have that conversation, we need to remember that historically a diocese has been a bishop and the people in that general area. It hasn't been a state or a governmental kind of relationship. Well, it was through the Middle Ages and going back to kind of Emperor Constantine kind of time. But if you go back to the ancient part of the church was about relationships between the bishop and the people. It was not about relationships like governmental hierarchical relationships. So what is a diocese? I think a diocese is a group of Christian people worshiping in a variety of different buildings or configurations, whether those are house churches or cathedrals, and that the bishop is the person who kind of unifies that group of the Jesus movement together, helping make sure they are working together, helping make sure they are sharing resources, helping make sure they are responding to the needs of the world. The bishop is the chief teacher of the faith and the guardian of the faith for that group of churches. The bishop helps make sure that there's enough priests and deacons to serve the people there. The role of the bishop is to be a servant who supports, nurtures, and sustains the church in a particular geographical area. And for my money, that means the bishop needs to have a relationship with the people. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to have breakfast with your bishop every week, but it should mean that you know your bishop better than you know the mayor or the governor of your state. It should mean that you look to your bishop for wisdom and guidance in your spiritual life. Now, I realize that we've had a huge drift in the Episcopal Church towards congregationalism, and that many Episcopalians think that their church, their individual congregation, is their primary point of contact. They think of their bishop as a kind of distant administrative figure who comes through and wears a funny hat and lays hands on people once every year or 18 months, something like that. And they bristle against and are rightly concerned about this external diocesan structure that is imposing things on them that they don't really understand. My friends, I think in the future, as the financial strains affect all of us, if that governmental relationship understanding is what we think a diocese is, we're all in trouble. What we need for the future is a re-emphasis on the relationships that congregations have with each other, the relationships that wardens in those congregations have with each other, the relationships that we all have with our bishop, because that bishop is a unifying force who can help us all see what's going on in the other parts of the church and in the other parts of the congregation. That bishop who helps gather us together for important liturgical and sacramental functions, but gathering us all together, not as a distant administrator of enforcing the rules and regulations, but as the person that helps us all come together and nurture our relationships of love in Jesus Christ so that we can all grow in the faith. But now, the economic pressures that are coming on the nature of our being church is actually challenging the nature of what it means for us to have bishops. And I think it's time for us to have a conversation in Episcopal Church about what sort of relationship we want to have with our bishop. Because it's a very different thing if you have one bishop looking after a vast geographical territory, or if you have a bishop and a series of suffragan bishops looking after a vast geographical territory, or if you have some dioceses with lots of money and lots of staff and other dioceses that are really struggling. Now, of course, I know that there have always been missionary bishops that have operated on a shoestring in the history of the church, and that is true even in the diocese that I look after, the Diocese of the Rio Grande. But my question really is, do we want bishops who are kind of distant governmental figures with a kind of oversight that looks like governance? Is that the relationship we want? Is that what we think a bishop should be? Because if a bishop is supposed to just kind of enforce the rules and regulations, make sure the policy is looked after, and do ceremonial functions from time to time, then we might have one bishop looking after a wide group of territory, like I see in some other denominations. One other denomination I work with closely, their bishop looks after Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. That's a vast geographical territory, but in that denomination, the role of bishop is not understood as having any kind of close pastoral relationship in the same sort of a way. Some of my colleagues in other denominations, the bishop has to be invited in order to come to any congregation. And the bishop really has just ceremonial function as she's invited in to celebrate things like a 100th anniversary of a congregation or that sort of a thing. Our tradition, of course, emphasizes the relationship, the pastoral relationship between the people in the pews and the bishop through things like confirmation and reception, and also through ordination, in which it is the bishop's responsibility to make sure that there are sufficient numbers of priests and deacons to make sure that the sacraments and the ministry of the church are extended throughout the geographical territory that is looked after by that particular bishop. The bishop traditionally has had the role of connecting our diocese together, making sure there is unity among the church by having the bishops meet regularly and work together, supporting one another in ministry. The bishops also connect each congregation in a diocese with all the other congregations so that there is a larger perspective and a wider horizon. A bishop is supposed to be a focus of unity, drawing the congregations together. I don't think that the economic realities of the world should affect our theology of what a bishop should be. In Episcopal Church, I think it's about time we got together and made our economic reality in the church look like the theology that we proclaim. For me, that means I think it's important that people have an actual pastoral relationship with their bishop. And that means dioceses should not get too big, or that becomes impossible. I think having a bishop with a large executive staff to look after a vast geographical territory or look after a couple hundred congregations makes the relationship that the people have with their bishop distant and administrative, which I don't think is historical, and I don't think it's positive for the life of the church. I think the people and the clergy would much rather have a close relationship with their bishop than a distant administrative governmental one. I know that in our diocese, congregations today need more help and support from outside than they did even 10 years ago. Congregations are struggling to find treasurers, junior wardens, senior wardens, and even sometimes vestry members. They struggle to maintain their parish properties. Now, I know some of our congregations, particularly the well-resourced ones, particularly the well-endowed ones, aren't even noticing that they are relying more and more on their endowments and the legacy of their financial strength from the past in order to pay today's bills. But what I see in this troubling trend is that the financial stresses and strains that we are all experiencing together are being unequally borne by the weaker congregations that don't have the same amount of resources, and by the weaker dioceses which don't have the same amount of resources. And that's a theological and ecclesiological problem for all of us, because I don't want the economics of our world to tell us what we think a bishop should be. Instead, I think we ought to have a theological conversation about what we think a bishop is for, and about the kind of relationship we think people should have with their bishop, and the kind of work we think a bishop should do. And then we ought to build our church so that in all 16 countries, in Province 9, and in Europe, as well as in all 50 states of the United States, that a bishop should have the resources that they need to do the job that we have all decided that bishop needs to do. And my hope, just speaking personally, as one of those bishops, is that the bishop's role can continue to be as a teacher and a pastor with actual relationships with actual people, not a distant, remote governor who enforces policy. Jesus said, in the world, their leaders lord it over them, but it shall not be so with you. With you, a leader shall be the servant of all. I think bishops are called to be servants of the people, and we can't really do that if we don't know the people. If people feel disconnected from their bishop, they don't see how our church is connected together, and they don't have the perspective of all those other congregations what the bishop is visiting. They don't see how the bishop is working with the other bishops around the church to help raise us all up. But if you have a personal relationship with your bishop, because your diocese is small enough that you can get to know your bishop, and if your bishop is committed to communicating with all the tools that are available, then we're going to find ways to meet the needs that we are all facing. It's about the relationships, my friends. Let's focus on figuring out what relationship we should have with our bishop, rather than letting the economics of our current stresses and strains tell us what kind of relationship we should have. By analogy, I want to point out to you something that one of my colleagues in the House of Bishops shared with us just this spring. Over the last 15 years, we have all watched as some seminaries have closed, and others have combined out of economic necessity, and others have been taken over by a congregation or by another seminary, and other seminaries have shifted to online only or hybrid forms of seminary education. The economic forces have decided what formation for priests looks like in our church while we all watched it happen. I personally wish we could get in a time machine and go back 30 years and all decide what should formation for the priesthood look like, and how can we make sure that that formation is available for everyone who's called to the priesthood, no matter which diocese they come from. The fact of the matter is there are plenty of resources in this Episcopal Church, and we should not sit back and let the economics tell us what the formation for priests should look like. And my friends, learning from that lesson, we should not sit back and let the economics of church tell us what a bishop is. Not for us in the Episcopal Church, not for we who value the apostolic succession, not for we who think it is important that when confirmation happens and the bishop puts their hands on your head, there is an actual physical personal relationship that goes back through history from your bishop, who can trace their apostolic line all the way back through the Church of England to Gregory the Great, and all the way back through the Roman tradition to the early days of the church. My friends, it matters to all of us what a bishop is and what kind of relationship we want our bishops to have. Let's not let the economic concerns tell us the answer to those questions. Let's instead think together about what kind of bishop the Episcopal Church wants to have. And then, my friends, there's really plenty of resources for us to make that happen throughout the Episcopal Church. Just a little food for thought from the Diocese of the Rio Grande. Please tell me your thoughts about this in the chat below. I think we need to have this conversation. And God bless you.